Welcome to this evening's Business Ethics Partnership Program from the Markkula Center for Applied Ethics. Our partnership here at Santa Clara is a learning community comprised of scholars and corporate executives exploring the current business ethics landscape. My name is Ann Skeet, Director of Leadership Ethics at the Markkula Center for Applied Ethics. That includes business, nonprofit, and leadership ethics. Our current partnership members, many of whom are here this evening, are Agilent, Cisco, Flex, EY, Google, Rambus, and Wilson Sonsini, and we thank them for their participation and support. Tonight, we explore the growing body of work in the realm of behavioral ethics, joined by two pioneers in their respective areas of expertise. With all the evidence to support rational, good choices in the workplace or the marketplace, why don't we all behave that way when we think we will? To help us understand the choices we make in our professional and personal lives, we are joined tonight by Ann Tenbrunsel and Hersh Shefrin. I'm going to share a little bit about Ann's background, and then she's going to share some remarks with you, and then I'll come back up and introduce Hersh to you, and then the three of us will take some questions at the end. Ann Tenbrunsel is the David E. Gallo Professor of Business Ethics at the College of Business Administration at the University of Notre Dame. Her current research interests focus on the psychology of ethical decision-making, examining why employees, leaders, and students behave unethically despite their best intentions to the contrary. Ann is the author, co-author, or co-editor of 6 books on this topic, including Blind Spots, Why We Fail to Do What's Right and What to Do About It. Forbes.com says of Ann in her book, Blind Spots is full of studies in human behavior, and those results can help us and the people we manage make better decisions. The book should be required reading for anyone entering the business world or for those of us who still try to reconcile misdeeds that did not have to be. Ann teaches at the executive, MBA, and undergraduate levels. Prior to entering academics, she worked as an engineer for SC Johnson & Son and as a sales and marketing consultant for ZS Associates. Please join me in welcoming Ann Tenbrunsel.
Pleasure to be here. I'll probably be walking a little bit. Thanks to all of you for coming by, especially those of you after a long day of work and those of you that actually had to do some tough commuting. When I first started getting involved in this research now more than 2 decades ago, one of my first presentations was at a prominent university in the state, not as prominent as Santa Clara, but one that had me intimidated. And a very well-known faculty member raised their hand after my talk and said, well, this is all very interesting, Ann, but what are you going to study when this is no longer a fad? Well, thanks to the companies that came along after I got started in this, I'm still in business. But for those of us who have been around long enough, who have studied this long enough, know that these companies that grabbed headlines were simply preceded by companies that grabbed headlines in their own day and in their own time. We see this cycle of unethical behavior despite some pretty significant efforts. Efforts at the regulatory level, efforts at the organization level with people spending millions on codes of conduct and training, and certainly efforts at the educational level where many universities are trying to figure out how do we further infuse ethics into our curriculum. Yet despite this, we continue to see this cycle. And many of us would argue that the reason for this is because we haven't taken the psychology of the decision maker into account. And this is where the somewhat newly named field of behavioral ethics, I think, can lend some insight. And that is, it's a field that really seeks to understand why is it that all of us, you and myself, deviate from our values and actually don't realize that, in fact, we're doing so. What we're talking about is what my co-author Max Bazerman and I have called blind spots. So I'd like to talk to you about the first 2 and just hint at the second 2 in case they come up during some of the questions. The first blind spot can perhaps best be described by the reaction I typically get at a cocktail party or an event where people say, well, what do you study? And I say, I study why people behave unethically. And they'll say, oh, well, that's interesting. You know, that stuff is for other people because, in fact, I'm quite ethical. These are the biased illusions of our own ethicality. And you may say, well, Ann, that really, honestly, though, doesn't pertain to me. I care a lot about ethics. I think about ethics. That's why I'm here. That's why I went through the commute. I don't know much about you, unfortunately, but we can take a look at people that presumably care and know a lot about. That brings us to the second blind spot, and that is what ethical dilemma, the role of ethical fading. Turns out that the first thing our mind does when we're encountering a decision is it asks, probably not even with your awareness, what kind of decision is this? It's a financial decision, it draws up relevant financial criteria. It's a legal decision, it draws up relevant legal criteria. And then it makes a decision using those criteria. It has to do that. We can't consider every criteria that's possible for every decision. We'd never be able to kind of get out of decision limbo. What we worry about, though, is when that calling up, that categorization, doesn't include ethics in those criteria. Because again, it doesn't matter how many you have, values and principles, they simply aren't going to be applicable to this situation. We can see how this third blind spot has to do with reward systems. They also direct our attention sometimes away from the ethics because of our desire to meet goals. And the fourth blind spot has to deal with, not only the first three deal with our inability to see our own ethical behavior, the fourth blind spot is our inability to see the unethical behavior of others when it's not in our best interest to do so, what we refer to as motivated blindness. The goal of all of this research, not just my own, but the many people that are now involved in it, is not to say, gosh, that's too bad, I guess we're bad people, we're more schmucks than I wish we were. But to begin to use this to become not only the people we want to be, but also to design the organizations that can allow people to be the people that they want to be. Thank you very much. Sorry if I talk fast.
Thank you, Anne, very much. I just want to remind you that we'll be taking your questions for our conversation after Hersh is done with his remarks. So if there are things that Anne covered that pique an interest, please jot them down on those cards and send them out to the edges, and my colleagues from the Ethics Center will collect them. It's now my pleasure to introduce Hersh Shefrin. Hersh is the Mario L. Bellotti Professor of Finance at Santa Clara University. He is one of the pioneers in the behavioral approach to economics and finance. His book, Beyond Good and Fear, provided the first comprehensive treatment of behavioral finance and was written for practitioners as well as academics. In 2009, J.P. Morgan Chase placed it among the top 10 books published since 2000. Shefrin has spent his entire career studying risk from different angles. His work in mathematics focused on Bayesian combinatorics, and I had to look that up, a set of formulas developed in the 18th century to assign probabilities in cases of uncertainty, and it has been the focus of his work in economics. Hersh's focus in finance has been on the psychology of risk. In addition to his experience chairing audit committees, Hersh's consulting work with large financial institutions has focused on behavioral risk management, which is the topic of his new book. A global financial services firm that has worked with him says, Hersh is a pioneer in behavioral risk management who is always looking at the application of the concepts he teaches. He predicted the BP oil spill long before it happened and has the capacity to understand very complex businesses and offer very pragmatic solutions. We look forward to hearing from you, Hersh.
Thank you, Anne, for that kind introduction. And it's a real thrill for me to be paired with Anne Tenbrunsel on this particular topic. So I want to talk today about rogue trading as an example to try and give us some intuition about the way that finance and psychology and ethics all interconnect. So give you a sense of the plan for the discussion. I want to begin by providing a little bit of a flavor of what the psychological backdrop is for rogue trading, and to do that, I'll draw on the work of Nobel Prize winner Daniel Kahneman and his late co-author Amos Tversky. Then I'm going to move into two stories about rogue trading in the 1990s and ask what we can learn about the way that psychology played itself out during those particular episodes. And then I want to move into rogue trading during the 21st century and ask whether the old form of rogue trading from the 1990s and earlier is our father's rogue trading, and that things have changed in terms of what rogue trading means today. So I had a little bit of a sliver of these ideas in the book itself when I was writing Behavioral Risk Management. But for this talk, I drew on an article that I wrote that came out last month to kind of really try and distill the key essence of what rogue trading means from a psychological, ethical, and financial perspective. So psychology. It was in the right place at the right time. I came to Santa Clara and the Bay Area at a time when Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman were here visiting Stanford at a critical period in the development of behavioral economics, and really sort of learned firsthand how to think like a psychologist as well as an economist. They put together a set of ideas that Kahneman encapsulated in his best-selling book, Thinking Fast and Slow. And I want to pull one of those examples out and ask us to imagine that we're participating in one of their key experiments. Experiment goes something like this. I want you to imagine that you're going to be facing a concurrent choice and you're going to be asked to make two decisions. You'll make the decisions at the same time, and then you'll learn later how the risks associated with those decisions play out, and you'll learn the outcomes also at the same time. That's what makes them concurrent decisions. So the first of your two decisions involves a situation where you can experience only potential gains. Choice number A is you can accept a sure $2,400. Choice number B is to take a risk. There's a 75% chance you won't win anything, but a 25% chance you'll win 10,000 bucks. So that is going to be your first choice, and your second choice is what happens when you face a potential loss. Your C choice is to accept a sure $7,500 loss, but you can, instead of choosing C, choose D, which is to take a risk. The risk is 75% chance that you'll lose 10,000, even more, but a 25% chance you won't lose anything at all. So if you were facing these two, question is, what would you do? Would you choose A or B? Would you choose C or D? So think about it. If you were really involved and this was real money, and here's what typically happens. I've sort of replicated this experiment worldwide with undergraduate students, graduate students, financial practitioners, very wealthy people. The patterns are very strong. Most people choose the sure gain A over the risky B. But when it comes to choosing between C and D, instead of choosing the sure C, which is what a risk-averse person would do, most people will choose to take the risk. Gambling for resurrection. The last case. This is Kwaku Adeboli, born in Ghana, but grew up in the UK. He started as a summer intern at UBS in London, and he's a very, very smart guy. And he rose up through the ranks very quickly. He was put on a trading desk shortly after he'd done well, sort of in a back office position. And then, very soon thereafter, he became director of the desk. And he was a good trader. But very early on, he felt pressure. And so he, like Iguchi, put a system in place to hide his losses. He called it the umbrella. That was the name he gave his system. And he took, like Kerviel, very high-risk bets that should have been low-risk bets. And so the real positions of those bets went up and down. Sometimes he made huge amounts, sometimes smaller amounts. When they were losses, he just buried them in his umbrella. And then one day, he found that the bank had honored him for his success, which made him feel even more pressure. So they worked him hard. They set very high aspirations for him. Most importantly, in 2009, just after we'd gone through the worst of the financial crisis, UBS's new CEO Oswald Grubel, came into the bank and said, we as a bank are not taking enough risk. This 1 year after the Swiss government bailed out UBS to the tune of $60 billion. And so he put a lot of pressure on the traders in London. And Adebole just felt that pressure. So he didn't sleep much. He was always under stress, and he was always trying to hide. And then one day he made a loss that was so big he couldn't hide it anymore. The risk managers found it. They called him in. He explained what happened. He never even left the building to go home and pick up his stuff. They basically called in Scotland Yard, and he went off and was tried, convicted, and jailed. And then after he came out of prison, UK told him, you know, you're not a British citizen. So we're going to deport you to Ghana, which is sort of a battle that he's facing now. Now, with these two, with Adebole and Kerviel, what you have that's different is this. Both of them, there was enough general supervision in place, in theory, to have caught them. Grubel's dictate to the risk management desk was, everything we've been doing to double check what our traders are doing, get rid of those double checks. So the culture was changed, the processes were changed, and what you had was something whereby both of these traders were encouraged, either directly or indirectly, to engage in this high-stake, high-risk trading. And when it worked well, it reflected well on the banks because they were profitable, and well on the CEOs who could report great earnings. And when it didn't work well, it wasn't the bank's problem, but you had a natural scapegoat. And that's the issue. So The Economist, when they were commenting on the Adebole issue, said, well, look, what can you expect if you take somebody who's smart and ambitious like Adebole, and you throw billions at them, and then you pressure them? You're asking for a disaster. And I think that's right. I think that's right. So Anne set the stage when she talked about blind spot number 3, dangerous reward systems. But the other stuff is also there. But the dangerous reward systems are critical. So in the end, all 4 of these guys have had became public personas. All of them talked about what it was like to be on the wrong side of the ethical line. Iguchi wrote his book, Self-Confessional. Nick Leeson wrote a book, Self-Confessional. Those were both on the slides about those two. Kerviel has been adamant to say he was continually checked by his superiors. It was no surprise what he was doing. And Adebole said, what I did was legally problematic, but I wasn't doing anything morally wrong. All right, so bottom line. First of all of us are prone to psychological features that predispose us to take risks when we're behind the 8 ball. Number 2, strong corporate cultures that include the ethical dimension can help deal with the vulnerabilities associated with individual psychology. You can see where in each of those 4 cases you had organizational weaknesses that allowed rogue trading to flourish. And third, the most important point I think, applies to the nature of financial institutions and what got us into the global financial crisis mess, which is, number one, fundamentally, just before we get it, before rogue trading, fundamentally, they're publicly traded corporations. They have thin capital margins, and what that means is that if something goes wrong, then they'll either go out of business or they'll be too big to fail and the taxpayer will bail them out. And since most of these institutions are too big to fail, you have set up a situation where it's even rational, not ethical, but rational for a self-interested executive to encourage traders like Kerviel and Adeboli to take huge risks. Because on the upside, they've got great severance packages they've negotiated in advance. And on the downside, they've got two cushions to catch them. One is the scapegoat cushion, these two cases. Or the other is the company's in such bad trouble that we simply do bailouts. Okay? The same way we bailed out AIG, for example. So in a nutshell, that's the story. Okay? Psychology, ethics, and psychology all intertwined with the stakes really huge. Thanks for your kind attention.
I'm going to get us started by asking the two of you, listening to your stories and the research that you've done, what advice you would give to executives and to corporate board members who are trying to figure out the implications of all of this in today's workplace. I mean, we'll start with you, Hersh.
So I think that the tone always starts at the top. And so you need to have leaders who have strong moral compasses, and to deal with Anne's blind spot in a really reflective way to assess whether those issues do apply to them so that they can set the tone at the top, and to figure out the extent to which they are prone to bias. Okay? So whether that 86% on the honesty score should be really more closer to 60 or 50 or maybe even 40. And once you've done that, to build structures, culture, and behaviors into the whole organizational fabric in order to address vulnerabilities associated with all these various biases and phenomena.
So I will pick up on what Hersh said, and I do really believe in that first blind spot, and that is that if everyone thinks that they're ethical and their companies are ethical, which they may be, but almost every one of us think they're better than they are, then I think we don't do a good enough job of really trying to find the problems. So at least last I knew, doing 360s on ethical illusions and looking at those pockets in the organization where those discrepancies are the biggest. So the leader says they're very ethical, and their subordinates are saying maybe not so much, right? As a place to be, it's a good place to focus, and that is neither party may be completely wrong, but it begins a conversation as to what is it that we're seeing that perhaps you're not. So if I were going to start with anything, it'd be identifying those illusions and then coming up with ways to address them. So we've done other research that shows you are better able to, for example, if you use the sexual harassment scenario, we couldn't run that study in today's world, but we could run similar studies. And we found that when you get people to predict their motivations at the time of the decision, they are better in their forecasting. So at least I realized, gosh, I might not say anything in that meeting when that person makes an inappropriate comment, or I might not say anything when that person kind of uses a language euphemism. At least I'm now prepared that I won't say anything, and I can begin to equip myself to do it. So we can engage in that type of training. I think the training we currently engage in asks people to, what would you do in this situation? And what we know from forecasting is we'd all predict we'd behave in line with our values because we're at a much more abstract level of thinking. So I think we need to take some of what we know and incorporate it into some of the processes that we already see in organizations and just make them better.
As Patrick brings me some of the questions from the audience, I'm curious, as you think about the fact that both of you touched on what I would sort of say are kind of the basics in the Maslow's hierarchy of needs. I mean, you talked about visceral reactions, fear, tired, hungry, and in some of the theoretical study work that you've done, you talk about security and aspiration and some things that come together. So just back to sort of the basic management 101 practice, what, that suggests to me that managers should be spending some time on making sure people's basic needs are met in the workplace in order to promote ethical behavior. And I'm just wondering if there's research or instances that back up that thought.
So I don't know of any specific. I think we're just at the beginning of being able to address the kinds of issues that you outlined, which allows me to gives me the luxury of being a little bit speculative. Okay? One of the things that we know about human psychology and risk-taking is that 3 of the most important emotions associated with what happens when we face a risk are fear, hope, and aspiration. And people who are excessively fearful tend not to take risks that are worth taking in an actuarial sense. And people who are excessively hopeful tend to shoot for the stars when it's not exactly appropriate. And people who set themselves really high goals and for whom succeeding is really, really important wind up being vulnerable to taking imprudent risks. And so I think what happens in a situation like the rogue trading case is that traders who become rogue traders find themselves in situations where the goals are set so high and the pressures to succeed is so great that they take imprudent risks. And organizationally, I think what that means we need to do is to figure out how it takes a village to help each other deal with excesses that our psychological makeups will induce us to do. And what that means is really having a perspective where you don't have ethical fading away when it comes to checking on the people who we are pressuring, but you have a sense yourself as to how far it's reasonable to push them, and to do it in a way with a clear psychological understanding of what it means to have fear, hope, and aspiration driving the decision making.
I would bridge on a couple of those pieces. There is some research on some of that. There's a new burgeoning field on abusive supervision, which certainly links abusive supervision to unethical behavior. It doesn't have to be that coercive. It can be bullying. It can be including people and not including people. So you can almost go back to bullying in the playground. And certainly abusive supervision can lead to unethical behavior for a variety of reasons, and isolation and some other bad things. So that's kind of the fear piece. The study I briefly referred to, I think it's out of Wharton, at least that's where I saw it published, looked at maybe 2 decades of SEC data, and they found 2 types of fraud. One is opportunistic fraud. Those are not the people I study, and I don't think Hersh does either. But the other was people that took risks, and it was more linked to people with overconfidence. So, you're falling short. They're not doing it because, for most of the time, they're doing it in their mind for good reasons. Oh gosh, I'm sure we're going to make it up next quarter. We always do. This just happened to be an off quarter. So you do some things to make this quarter look better, confident you're going to be able to make it up. Well, that doesn't always play out, and then you lead to this kind of slippery slope. So certainly some link between overconfidence and some of the things that Hersh is talking about. And there's a good study that looks specifically at goals, which is another thing that Hersh refers to. What they find is that really difficult goals compared to really easy goals, that's pretty intuitive, leads to more unethical behavior. But interesting, really difficult goals leads to more unethical behavior than do your best goals. So, and there is some research that suggests that do your best goals also can lead to better productivity. It's a whole line of research that we won't be able to cover. Interesting to me is that the reason that occurs is because people become very depleted. It's too much to think about these difficult goals, so they become very fatigued. Also that same research shows that goals that start out tough and get easier versus goals that start out easy and get tough, say over the year, even if they're exactly the same from an average, they cross. Those that start out more difficult lead to more unethical behavior, again, because of the rapid depletion that occurs. And then the third part of that, which I actually thought was probably the coolest part, anticipating difficult goals before I ever even start working on them also leads to resource depletion, also leads to unethical behavior. So when we think about this kind of pressure that Hersh did a really great job articulating, I think we do need to think about that in our workforce. I think you're starting to see a change. So several years ago, law firms, as part of a project, you certainly saw people were expected to answer their emails at any time of the day, 3 a.m., 2 a.m. If the client emailed you, you would have it by your bed and you would answer them. You are now starting to see law firms implement policies that say things like after 8 p.m., our associates will be turning off their email until 8 a.m. the next day. I think we need to think a lot, certainly been a lot of discussion, about the 24/7 mentality that we have, the overload of information, what our expectations, what our work boundaries are. If we're not giving people time to rejuvenate, they are going to be cognitively depleted, and that for sure almost will lead to more unethical behavior. So you're certainly seeing organizations, I actually think Google's one of them, participating a lot in things like meditation. So bringing us back, how do we get back to abstract levels of thinking? So we're not just making these myopic, bark on the tree decisions at every point, but we have kind of a forest level view. So those are some of the things that kind of the cautionary flags, but maybe some ways to think about how to structure our goals and compensation systems, as well as what kind of bad managers. It's not okay to have a bully as a boss. It's just not. It has so many negative ramifications. And I think that is one of those things of motivated blindness. I think we look the other way as long as they're performing. And I don't think we realize kind of the circles of detriment that occur.
And you mentioned sort of the being on 24/7. Certainly in a global workforce, so many companies are working across time zones and really find, or at least make the case for people needing to be on phone calls first thing in the morning and last thing at night, and that kind of behavior. So we know that in our business ethics partnership discussions, this is something that's come up. Google's actually one of the companies that participates actively, and so we find ourselves talking about things that I think we would not have been considering in that kind of exchange a couple of years ago, including mindfulness as a way to promote ethical behavior in companies. So just in closing, Hersh, I'm going to ask you, are there any, you touch a lot on bias in your work as well. Are there differences in Silicon Valley and the biases that present the most challenge for people here than there are in other parts of the country and the world, or do you find that we're not as unique as we think we are?
We're not as unique as we think we are, just more so in Silicon Valley. So I think we are subject to the same psychological issues, whether they're emotionally driven or whether they're vulnerability to bias and error, as in other parts of the world. But we do it in a somewhat different way. So the culture of Silicon Valley when it comes to risk-taking is different than in most other places. This is a risk-taking culture. This is a culture where goals are set very high. And so this whole issue about the psychology that drives rogue trading makes us quite vulnerable to that whole set of issues here in Silicon Valley. We only tend to focus on successes, but there are a lot of failures and a lot of sad stories. So I think that we need to be careful about that. I don't know why, but I think the biggest concern I have about Silicon Valley is that we let our dreams get ahead of us. So the valuations of companies in Silicon Valley just tend to be, from time to time, completely unrealistic. If you sit down and do the math, okay, there just aren't enough atoms in the universe to support the kind of valuations in some of our companies, but those companies grab our imagination and attention. And that gives rise to all kinds of issues that have problems, that lead to problems both locally but also globally. So I would say that we do have some issues to confront on that side.
Thank you both for joining us. In the interests of making sure you're all not tired or hungry, I encourage you to join us outside for some food and drink and an opportunity to visit more with Ann and Hersh and ask questions of them and one another about what you've heard this evening. Thank you very much, both of you, for joining us this evening, and thank you very much for coming and your time and attention.